It was early morning when the city was still waking up, and the sky held that faint golden hue that only lasts a few minutes. The airport was alive with the sounds of rolling suitcases, muffled announcements, and people rushing to their gates with coffee in hand. Among the crowd was a man named David Johnson. He wasn't someone who liked attention. In fact, he often went out of his way to blend in, even though he had every reason not to. He had built a successful business from the ground up, but unless you knew him personally, you would never guess it from his calm and modest appearance. That morning, he wore a navy blue blazer over a white shirt, simple jeans, and clean sneakers. He had a small carry-on bag with his laptop, some documents, and a book he never seemed to have time to read. He had been up since 4 a.m., preparing for a meeting that would take place in New York later that afternoon. It wasn't his first business trip, and it wouldn't be his last. Traveling had become a routine part of his life, though it wasn't something he particularly enjoyed. He had learned to treat airports like brief waiting rooms between the places that really mattered. As he walked through the terminal, he noticed the usual morning rush, families with strollers, groups of tourists taking selfies, and business travelers moving briskly with eyes fixed on their phones. The air smelled faintly of brewed coffee and cinnamon rolls. He smiled to himself as he passed a group of kids laughing over a spilled milkshake. For a moment, it reminded him of simpler days before business meetings, before deadlines, before owning things that seemed to own him back. He reached the gate area about 40 minutes before boarding. The flight was a short one, less than 2 hours to New York, but he had booked a first-class seat for comfort. After all, he would need to go straight from the airport to a meeting, and a bit of rest before that would help. He found a seat near the window and placed his bag on the floor beside him. Pulling out his phone, he checked a few emails and confirmed the hotel car service for his arrival. Around him, other passengers were starting to gather. Most were dressed in suits and blazers, probably other business travelers like him. The gate agent stood behind the counter, typing away and checking boarding passes. Everything seemed normal at first, but then he noticed a slight change in tone when the first-class boarding was announced. The gate agent, a woman with sharp eyes and a polite but distant smile, began calling passengers forward. One by one, people stepped up, scanned their passes, and were greeted with warm smiles and friendly chatter. But when it was David's turn, something changed. He handed over his boarding pass with his usual calm, expecting the usual beep and nod. Instead, the woman hesitated. Her eyes flicked from the ticket to his face, then back to the screen. Her expression shifted, still polite but with something uncertain behind it. Sir, can you please hold on for a moment?" she said, her tone careful. David nodded. "Of course," he replied softly, not thinking much of it at first. She typed something into the computer, frowning slightly. Then she whispered to her coworker, who leaned in to look at the screen. The two exchanged a few quiet words, and then the coworker shook his head. "I'm sorry, sir," the first woman said finally, straightening up. "It seems there's been an issue with your seat assignment." "What kind of issue?" David asked, keeping his tone polite but curious. "It looks like first class is full," she said quickly, as if rehearsed. "There must have been a booking error. We can seat you in the main cabin instead." David looked at her for a moment, not quite sure what to say. He had booked his ticket weeks ago, directly through the airline's official website. He had the confirmation email, the seat number, and the receipt showing the price difference he'd paid for first class. But more than that, it was the way she said it, the slight pause, the hint of discomfort in her voice, that made him pause. "I understand mistakes happen," he said calmly, "but I paid for a first-class seat." "Is there a manager I can speak to?" The woman hesitated again. She glanced at the coworker, who gave a subtle shrug, as if to say, "You handle it." Then she smiled tightly and said, "Our supervisor is assisting another gate right now, but I assure you, sir, the flight is full. We can offer you a refund for the price difference." David nodded slowly. He didn't want to cause a scene. That was never his style. He had been in too many situations where raising his voice only made people more defensive. So instead, he stepped aside politely, allowing the next few passengers to board while he waited. As he waited, he noticed something interesting. Several other people approached the counter, some with questions, some with late boarding passes. A man in a gray suit, clearly arriving last minute, handed his ticket to the same gate agent. She smiled brightly and said, "You're in luck, sir. There's still one seat left in first class." David's brows lifted slightly. He wasn't angry, just quietly observant. He watched as the man thanked her and walked confidently toward the jet bridge. He could see the label on the man's ticket, Seat 2A, the same seat number that had been printed on his own boarding pass. He took a slow breath, not out of frustration, but out of the quiet realization that this wasn't just a booking error. He'd seen that kind of moment before, the way someone looked at him, then made an excuse that sounded perfectly reasonable on the surface, but carried a meaning underneath. It was subtle. It was always subtle. Still, he stayed calm. He checked his phone again, made a note of the time, the agent's name tag, and the details of what just happened. It wasn't about revenge or anger, it was about awareness, about not letting moments like these slip by unnoticed. After a few more minutes, boarding was nearly complete. The same agent turned to him and said, "Sir, we've reassigned you to seat 17C. It's an aisle seat, plenty of legroom." David nodded. "Thank you," he said quietly, and took the new boarding pass. As he walked down the jet bridge, he could feel the difference in the atmosphere. The people ahead of him in line smiled casually, chatting about weekend plans or upcoming meetings. No one else seemed to have had their seat changed. Inside the plane, he passed through first class, a section of wide seats and peaceful lighting, and saw the man in the gray suit already sipping orange juice in what was supposed to have been his seat. He didn't look long. He simply kept walking to his assigned seat near the back, where a young couple was trying to fit their bags into the overhead bin. He offered to help, lifting one of the heavier bags up for them. They thanked him, and he smiled faintly as he sat down. The flight attendants moved up and down the aisles, checking seatbelts and bags. The captain's voice came over the speaker, warm and cheerful, announcing the short flight ahead. Everything looked normal. Everything sounded normal. But inside, David felt that quiet, familiar feeling he'd known too many times before, a feeling that said this wasn't about a mistake. This was about perception. He didn't want to dwell on it, but his mind naturally went there. He thought about the years he had worked to build his business, the times he had walked into meetings only to be mistaken for a driver or an assistant. The times when people had been surprised that the man signing the contracts looked nothing like what they had imagined. He had learned to keep his dignity intact, to never let the smallness of others make him small too. But still, every now and then it stung. Not deeply enough to wound, but just enough to remind him that no amount of success or money could erase the way some people saw him at first glance. The engines roared softly as the plane began to taxi down the runway. Outside, the morning sun had risen fully now, painting the clouds in a soft gold light. He leaned back, closed his eyes, and took a slow breath. The seat wasn't as comfortable as the one he'd paid for, but it didn't matter. He wasn't going to let it ruin his day. Still, somewhere inside him, a quiet thought formed, not out of pride, but out of purpose. He thought about how ironic it all was. The people who had looked at him and seen someone ordinary, someone undeserving of first-class treatment, had no idea that he wasn't just a passenger. He was the man behind the company logo on the side of the plane, the one who had built the airline from near bankruptcy into a national success, the one whose vision and persistence had created the very opportunity they now took for granted. He smiled faintly, not with arrogance, but with a kind of quiet strength. Life had taught him that sometimes the best response to judgment wasn't anger, it was patience. And sometimes silence was the most powerful answer of all. As the plane lifted off, the ground disappearing beneath the clouds, David opened his laptop. He began typing a few notes for his upcoming meeting, but his mind wandered for a moment. He thought about the gate agent, about her expression when she looked at him. He wondered what she would think if she knew who he really was. Not out of ego, but out of curiosity. Would she regret it? Would she even remember? He doubted it. For her, it was probably just another day, another passenger, another mistake. But for him, it was a reminder of why he built what he built. To create something that went beyond faces and assumptions. To build a business where merit mattered more than image. The flight continued smoothly. A flight attendant offered him a drink, and he smiled and accepted a cup of coffee. The young couple beside him chatted quietly about their vacation plans. He listened absently, smiling at their excitement. It grounded him, reminded him that despite the things that went wrong in the world, there were still moments of simple joy all around. After about an hour, he closed his laptop and looked out the window. The clouds below looked like soft cotton fields stretching endlessly. He thought about how strange life could be, how it could humble you and lift you up in the same breath. He thought about his journey from a small-town kid who once dreamed of flying to a man who now owned an airline. He thought about how, even now, people still sometimes failed to see the full picture. But that was all right. He didn't need them to. The captain announced the descent into New York. Passengers began to stir, stretching, checking their phones, preparing for landing. As the plane touched down smoothly, David felt calm. He wasn't angry. He wasn't bitter. He just knew that someday, someone in that same situation might not handle it as quietly as he did, and that was why he'd keep pushing, keep building, keep changing the spaces he had the power to change. When the seatbelt sign turned off, he waited patiently for others to get their bags. As he stood up, he noticed the man from seat 2A ahead of him, chatting cheerfully with a flight attendant. She was complimenting his tie, laughing at something he said. The man gave David a brief glance, one of those passing looks that barely registered a person before looking away. David smiled faintly. He didn't need acknowledgement. He didn't need anyone to know who he was, but one day soon they would. Not through confrontation, but through the quiet power of his actions. As he walked out of the plane and into the terminal, the air smelled different, cooler, sharper, filled with the noise of New York mornings. He took a deep breath, pulled his blazer tight around him, and began walking toward the car that was waiting to take him to his meeting. He had things to do, people to meet, and a company to continue shaping. The small incident at the gate would have meant nothing to most people, just a moment easily forgotten. But to him it was a mirror reflecting the quiet truths of how the world sometimes worked, and how he could keep doing his part to change it. Not through words, but through leadership, fairness, and respect. He glanced once more toward the runway, where the plane he had just stepped off from stood gleaming under the morning sun, the name of his airline printed boldly along its side, a name that represented everything he had worked for. He smiled again, this time with quiet pride. No one there knew it, but the man who had just been told he didn't belong in first class was the very person who had made that plane fly. The car that came to pick David up from the airport was a black sedan, clean and simple, the kind often used by business travelers. The driver greeted him politely, took his bag, and opened the door for him. The city air was cool that morning, with that mix of fuel, coffee, and something faintly sweet from a nearby bakery. New York always had that smell, busy, alive, restless. As the car pulled away from the terminal, David leaned back in his seat and looked out the window. The skyline was just beginning to sharpen against the morning light, tall glass buildings catching the sun like mirrors. He felt calm on the surface, but his mind was quietly replaying the moment at the gate. He wasn't angry, not really, just thoughtful. He had experienced moments like that before, subtle, polite, wrapped in smiles but carrying a message he could still feel. It used to bother him deeply when he was younger. He used to wonder if maybe he should change how he looked, how he dressed, or even how he spoke. But over time he realized it didn't matter how polished he was. Some people made judgments before he ever said a word. Now, though, it wasn't anger that lingered. It was curiosity. The part of him that liked to understand people, to study behavior, couldn't stop thinking about the woman at the gate, the small hesitation in her voice, the quiet exchange with her coworker, the quick decision to move his seat without even asking a question. He knew she probably didn't mean harm. She was likely following an instinct she couldn't even explain. That was the strange thing about bias. It didn't always look cruel. Sometimes it looked like politeness with a hidden wall behind it. The car moved through traffic, the city humming around him. He pulled out his phone, checked his messages, and saw a note from his assistant reminding him about the meeting schedule. The company he was meeting with that day was an investor group interested in expanding Horizon Air's routes internationally. It was a big deal and he needed to be focused, but focus wasn't coming easily. His thoughts drifted back again to that brief moment at the airport. He wondered how often that kind of thing happened, not just to him but to others who didn't have his calmness or resources. People who maybe got angry or embarrassed or simply accepted it quietly and moved on. He sighed softly and turned his attention back to the city. The driver, a middle-aged man with kind eyes, caught his gaze in the rearview mirror and said, "Busy morning, sir?" David smiled faintly. Always is in this city, he replied. Business trip? Yes, meeting later today. Just flew in from Atlanta. The driver nodded. I used to live down there years ago. Good people. Lot calmer than up here. David chuckled lightly. That's true. New York has its own kind of energy. They shared a few more light words before falling into a comfortable silence. The car weaved through traffic smoothly and David's phone buzzed again. It was his assistant checking in. Hope flight was good. Everything ready at the office. He smiled at the message but didn't reply immediately. He stared at it for a few seconds, thinking about how strange it was that Hope flight was good, carried so much weight this time. When he arrived at the hotel, the staff recognized him right away. They greeted him with warm smiles and quiet efficiency, escorting him to a private meeting suite. He had been there many times before. The hotel had a way of making business feel calm, almost personal, the kind of place that understood how to treat people well, no matter who they were. After checking in and freshening up, he sat at the desk near the window with his laptop open. The view stretched across the city and below. People moved like currents of energy, tiny but purposeful. He started reviewing the presentation for the afternoon meeting, scrolling through slides about growth, roots, partnerships, and numbers that would impress even the toughest investor. But after a few minutes, he stopped. His focus wasn't there. His mind was still somewhere back at the airport gate. He thought about that moment again, but this time he saw it differently. He thought about the larger picture, not the embarrassment or the slight, but the reason it mattered. The world was filled with good people who simply didn't realize how small actions could carry heavy meanings. Maybe the woman at the gate wasn't cruel, but what if her small choice reflected something deeper in the company culture, something he needed to address, not as the man who had been slighted, but as the leader responsible for shaping that culture? He picked up his phone and sent a quick message to his assistant. Schedule meeting with regional HR next week. Want to discuss staff training, she replied almost instantly. Of course. Anything specific? He typed back a customer interaction, fairness, awareness. Then he closed the phone and exhaled. He didn't want revenge. He wanted progress. He wanted the people working under his brand to be better than that, to see people as people, not profiles. A soft knock on the door interrupted his thoughts. A young hotel attendant entered with a tray of breakfast, coffee, fruit, toast, and eggs. David thanked him warmly, tipping generously. The attendant smiled shyly and said, I've seen you here before, sir. You always look so calm before big meetings. David chuckled softly. Calmness comes with practice, he said. It's not that I don't feel nervous. I just learned not to show it. The young man grinned. Well, whatever you're doing, it works. Good luck today. Thank you, David said, and meant it. After breakfast, he reviewed his notes once more and prepared to leave for his meeting. The city had come fully alive now, cars honking, people rushing, and the sound of distant construction filling the air. He always liked that sound. It reminded him of progress. The meeting took place in a glass building downtown, high above the noise of the streets. Inside, the conference room was bright and modern, with a long table and a view that stretched to the river. The investors arrived one by one, each shaking his hand, unaware that a few hours ago this calm, confident man had been told he didn't belong in a seat he'd paid for. The meeting went smoothly. He spoke with clarity, passion, and focus. When he talked about Horizon Air, he didn't just talk about profits or planes. He talked about people, the passengers, the employees, the culture. He talked about how every flight wasn't just a business transaction, but a small part of someone's life story. A reunion, a goodbye, a new beginning. The investors listened carefully. They could feel the sincerity in his words. That was something David had always believed in, authenticity. Numbers mattered, but values built longevity. By the time the meeting ended, several hands reached across the table to shake his. There were smiles, agreements, and the quiet certainty that something meaningful had been accomplished. As he left the building, his phone buzzed again. This time it was a message from one of his senior executives. Welcome back to the city, sir. Hope the flight was smooth. We'll have your report ready by tomorrow. David smiled to himself. The flight was fine, he replied simply. He didn't tell anyone what had happened, not yet. He wanted time to think, to understand how best to turn that small incident into something constructive. That evening, He decided to take a walk through the city. The lights had come on, painting everything in soft yellow and white glows. Street vendors were still open, the smell of roasted nuts and pretzels drifting through the air. He walked without a clear destination, just letting his thoughts wander. At one corner, he stopped at a small cafe. It wasn't fancy, just a warm little place with a few tables outside. He ordered a cup of tea and sat down, watching people pass by. The world was full of stories, he thought. Every person walking past him carried a whole world of their own, some visible, most hidden. He thought again of the woman at the gate. What if she had a story too? Maybe she was tired, overworked, or dealing with pressure from her supervisors. Maybe she wasn't aware of the subtle ways she had made him feel small. It didn't excuse it, but it helped him see it with empathy instead of anger. He pulled out his notebook and began to write, something he often did when his thoughts felt too full. He wrote about perception, about respect, about the quiet ways people could hurt each other without even realizing it. He wrote about how leadership wasn't about power, it was about responsibility. When he finished, he looked down at his notes and smiled. The pages weren't just about what happened at the airport. They were about the kind of company he wanted Horizon Air to be. One where stories like his didn't happen to anyone. A soft breeze passed through and he took a slow sip of tea. The world kept moving. Cars, laughter, footsteps. But he felt still for a moment. Grounded. His phone buzzed once more, but this time it wasn't business. It was a message from his sister. Hope your flight went well. Mom said she's proud of you. She saw your interview on TV last week. He laughed quietly to himself. Tell her I love her, he texted back. For a moment, the world felt peaceful again. He remembered where he came from, the long road that brought him here, the sacrifices, the late nights, the doubts. And now he sat here, sipping tea in the middle of New York, running an airline, and thinking about how to make it better. Later that night, as he returned to his hotel room, the city lights glowing through the window, he checked his email one last time. There was a message from HR confirming the meeting he had requested. Subject line, staff conduct and inclusion discussion. He smiled, typed a short reply, and shut his laptop. The quiet hum of the city outside filled the room. He didn't feel heavy or upset. He felt ready to make sure that next time, someone like him wouldn't have to stand at a gate being told there was a mistake. Because sometimes, real change didn't come from grand speeches or press releases. It came from quiet moments of reflection, moments that tested your patience and revealed your character. David turned off the light and lay back on the bed, staring up at the ceiling. His mind began to slow down at last. He thought about tomorrow, about the people he would meet, about the future he wanted his company to represent. And as he drifted toward sleep, one simple thought stayed with him, the same one that had guided him all his life. Treat people the way you want to be treated, even when they forget to do the same. He smiled at that thought, closed his eyes and let the city hum him to sleep. Somewhere out there, planes were taking off and landing under the Horizon Air logo, carrying people from one story to another, and the man who made it all possible was resting peacefully, already planning how to make those journeys a little more human. The morning came quietly, with a soft gray light slipping through the curtains of the hotel room. The city outside was already awake, filled with distant horns, the hum of engines, and the low rhythm of footsteps on wet pavement. David sat at the edge of the bed for a while before getting up, just breathing and collecting his thoughts. He had another full day ahead, meetings, calls, and travel plans, but something about today felt different. He stood by the window, looking out over the skyline. The clouds hung low and a light drizzle had started to fall. Drops streaked down the glass, making the city look softer somehow. He always liked mornings like this. They gave him time to think. The incident at the airport had stayed with him, not in a heavy way, but as a reminder, like a note left in the back of his mind that kept whispering, "There's something to be learned here." He wasn't the kind of man to hold grudges. He'd seen too much in life to waste time on anger. But he did believe in lessons, and he knew that one small moment could change how an entire company operated. After getting ready, he picked up his phone and saw a message from his assistant. Regional team meeting confirmed for Friday. HR will also attend. He smiled faintly. That was good. Change always started with a conversation. He ordered a light breakfast, ate quickly, and then packed his things. His next destination was the main Horizon Air office outside the city, a place he hadn't visited in a few weeks. The drive would take about an hour, and he didn't mind. He liked long drives. They gave him space to breathe and think. The car arrived right on time. As it moved through the city streets, David stared out at the passing faces. People hurrying with umbrellas, delivery trucks splashing through puddles, a mother walking her child to school. Every one of them had their own world of worries, hopes, and quiet dreams. He always tried to remember that, especially as someone who led thousands of employees. Every face had a story. When the car pulled into the parking lot of Horizon's regional headquarters, he felt a familiar mix of pride and humility. The building wasn't the biggest or flashiest, but it carried his company's name, the company he had built from nothing more than an idea and a stubborn refusal to quit. He stepped out, nodded to the security guard who smiled and said, "Good morning, Mr. Johnson," and walked inside. The lobby smelled faintly of coffee and new carpet. Employees moved briskly through the hallways, some carrying folders, others chatting softly in small groups. Most of them didn't expect to see him there today. He liked it that way. He preferred surprise visits. It gave him a clearer picture of how things really worked on a normal day. He greeted people as he passed, stopping now and then to ask simple questions. "How's your week going? Or everything running smoothly?" He listened more than he spoke. That was something he had learned early on. Real leadership wasn't about talking. It was about hearing the things no one else noticed. Eventually, he made his way to the operations floor where customer service and flight coordination teams worked. There were rows of computers, soft conversations, and the faint sound of phones ringing. It all looked calm on the surface, but he could sense small tensions. People watching him curiously, others pretending not to. He greeted the floor manager, a tall man with glasses and a quick smile. "Didn't expect to see you today, sir," the man said, shaking his hand. "I thought I'd drop in and see how things were going," David said casually. "Everything running well?" "Yes, sir. Smooth day so far." "That's good," David said, glancing around. "I'd like to speak with the gate staff supervisor if she's available." The manager nodded quickly. "Of course, I'll have her come in." A few minutes later, a woman in her early 30s entered the room holding a tablet. She looked slightly nervous, unsure what the visit was about. "Good morning," she said politely. "Good morning," David replied, smiling to ease her tension. "I just wanted to talk about our customer experience process, especially during boarding." The woman nodded, tapping her tablet. "Of course. We've been focusing on improving efficiency, keeping delays minimal." He raised a hand gently, interrupting. "That's good. But I'm more interested in how we're treating people while doing that." She blinked, uncertain. "You mean customer service?" "Yes," he said, his voice steady but soft. "I want to know if we're training our staff to see every passenger as more than just a seat number." The woman hesitated, thinking. "We do go through basic courtesy and service training, sir, but I suppose some of that comes down to personal behavior." He nodded slowly. It always does. There was a pause. She didn't quite understand where he was going with this. He decided not to explain just yet. Instead, he thanked her and asked to see a list of upcoming staff meetings. She handed him a schedule, and he made a note to attend the next one personally. As she left the room, he sat quietly for a moment, looking around at his team. Good people, all of them, hardworking, loyal, but even good people could carry habits they didn't realize were harmful. He knew that firsthand. Later that afternoon, he met with a few senior executives to review the company's growth plans. They discussed routes, maintenance, new aircraft purchases, and profits. Everything looked positive on paper, but when it came time for his turn to speak, he didn't talk about numbers. He leaned back in his chair, hands folded, and said, "We've built something good here, but it's not enough to grow fast. We have to grow right." The room went quiet. His tone was calm, but his words carried weight. "I had an experience recently," he continued. "Small moment at an airport gate. Nothing dramatic. But it reminded me that kindness and fairness can't just be slogans on our walls. They have to be habits in every person who works for this company." The executives exchanged looks. A few nodded, understanding. "I want to make sure no one ever feels unwelcome on our planes," David said. "Not because of how they look or how they dress or what someone assumes about them. If we say we're a people-first airline, then that has to mean something in real life. The head of operations, an older man who had been with the company from the early days, nodded slowly. "That's a good point, sir. We can review our service standards, maybe update training programs." "Do that," David said simply, "but make it more than a checklist. I want real conversations. I want every person wearing our uniform to understand the meaning of respect. It's not just about being polite, it's about being aware." They discussed it for a while longer, outlining ideas for new workshops, leadership training, and open feedback channels. It wasn't flashy work, but it was the kind that built strong foundations. When the meeting ended, David walked out feeling lighter. He knew it would take time, but this was how real change began, not through frustration, but through quiet persistence. That evening, he visited the hangar area, where maintenance crews worked on planes. The smell of fuel and metal filled the air, and the sound of tools echoed in the background. He always loved this part of the job, the practical side, the people who kept things running but rarely got noticed. He talked with a few of the engineers, asking about their shifts and how things were going. One of them, an older mechanic with grease on his hands, smiled and said, "It's good to see you down here, sir." "Not many CEOs visit the hangar floor," David grinned. "This is where the real work happens. I like to stay close to it," the man chuckled. "That's why people respect you, sir. You don't just sit in an office." David smiled at that but didn't respond. He didn't need praise. What mattered to him was staying connected to the people, the process, the purpose. As he left the hangar, the sun was setting. The sky glowed orange, and the planes lined up on the tarmac looked almost peaceful against the fading light. He paused for a moment, watching one take off. The roar of its engines filled the air, deep and powerful. He thought again about the woman at the gate, the small, simple moment that had started all this reflection. She didn't know who he was. To her, he was just another traveler, another face in line. But maybe that was exactly what he needed to experience. Maybe life had its own way of reminding him not to drift too far from the everyday realities of the people his company served. He smiled quietly. Sometimes lessons came disguised as inconveniences. Back in his car, as he was driven to his evening hotel, he began drafting an internal message for the company's staff bulletin. The words came naturally. "Every person who steps onto our planes is more than a customer. They're someone's family, someone's friend, someone with a story. Our job isn't just to get them from one place to another. It's to make sure they feel valued along the way." He read it over a few times, then added one more line. "The small things matter most." When he finally hit send, he felt at peace. That night, as he lay in his hotel room again, he thought about the journey that had brought him here. The boy who once dreamed of flying, the young man who faced rejection after rejection, the entrepreneur who risked everything to build something lasting. And now here he was, learning, still growing, still trying to do better. He smiled faintly in the dark, thinking how strange and beautiful life could be. One small act of unfairness at an airport gate had turned into a ripple that might make hundreds of employees and thousands of passengers see the world just a little more clearly. And as he closed his eyes, he knew one thing for sure. He didn't need to be recognized to make an impact. Real power didn't come from titles or ownership. It came from using those things to make life a little fairer for someone else. The morning came quietly again, and the city outside was bright with a mix of sunlight and noise. David sat by the window of his office, sipping his coffee slowly. It had been a few days since that small moment at the airport, and yet the memory still stayed with him, not as an irritation anymore, but as a reminder of how far he had come and how much further he still wanted his company to go. He had spent the past week quietly observing, checking how employees interacted with passengers, how they handled stress, and how they treated people they didn't know. It wasn't a secret investigation. It was simply something he felt he had to do as a leader who wanted to stay connected to the real world his company touched every day. That morning, his assistant knocked on the door and said, "Sir, the regional supervisors are ready for the video meeting." "Good," David replied, setting down his cup. He straightened his jacket and took a deep breath before walking toward the large conference screen. He preferred in-person meetings, but this one would do. He wanted to speak directly to the team responsible for the airport where the incident had happened. As the screen flickered on, faces appeared: supervisors, gate managers, senior staff. Everyone greeted him with polite smiles and quick waves. They looked slightly nervous. It wasn't every day the company's CEO called them personally. "Good morning, everyone," David began, his tone warm but steady. "I know this wasn't on your usual schedule, but I wanted to have a conversation with you, not about numbers or performance, but about people." They listened quietly. "I had an experience last week while flying from Atlanta to New York," he continued. "Nothing major, at least not on the surface. But it stayed with me. It reminded me that we can be great at business and still miss what truly matters, the human part." He saw a few people exchange glances. The regional director leaned forward slightly. "Was there an issue with one of our flights, sir?" David nodded slowly. "Yes. I was traveling under a regular booking just like any passenger, and at the gate there was what I'd call a misunderstanding." He could feel the quiet tension through the screen. "I had a first-class ticket," he said, his voice calm. "But I was told there was a mistake, and I was moved to economy. Later, I saw another passenger take that same seat." A long silence filled the room. Some of the managers looked shocked, others simply confused. David continued softly, "Now, mistakes happen. That's part of business. But what struck me wasn't the change. It was the way it was handled. The hesitation, the tone, the quiet assumption. I wasn't angry, but I realized something. If that could happen to me, imagine how many ordinary travelers might experience the same thing and never say a word." The faces on the screen looked serious now. The regional director cleared his throat carefully. "I'm very sorry to hear that, sir. I'll look into it immediately. Do you remember which gate or which staff member it was?" David nodded. "Yes, I remember her. But this isn't about one person. It's about a culture, about awareness, about making sure our people understand that service isn't just efficiency, it's empathy." He paused, letting his words settle. "I didn't tell her who I was," he said finally. "At the time, she didn't recognize me and I didn't correct her. I just observed. I wanted to see how she would treat me when I was simply a passenger, not a CEO." Now, a ripple of quiet surprise went across the faces on the screen. One of the supervisors looked visibly uneasy. David smiled faintly. "You can relax," he said softly. "I'm not here to punish anyone. I'm here to remind us all that leadership starts with example. If I, as the owner of this airline, can experience a moment of bias or indifference, then there's clearly room for improvement in how we train and lead." There was a long, thoughtful silence. The regional director finally said, "You're right, sir. We focus so much on punctuality and policy that sometimes we forget about perception. People remember how they were made to feel, not just how quickly they boarded." David nodded, pleased by that response. "Exactly. Every small interaction builds the story people tell about us. So, I want to begin something new. Starting next month, we'll launch a new program focused on awareness, on seeing beyond assumptions." He leaned slightly closer to the screen. "It's easy to serve people who look like what we expect. It takes more heart to serve everyone with equal respect. That's the kind of company we're going to be." For a moment, no one spoke. Then slowly, one of the supervisors began to nod. Others followed. There was understanding in their expressions, even humility. David smiled gently. "Thank you all. I know you work hard and I appreciate it. I just want to make sure no one forgets why we're here. We don't just move planes, we move people's lives." When the call ended, David sat quietly for a moment. The room was silent except for the faint hum of the air conditioning. He felt calm but thoughtful. Change wouldn't happen overnight, but the seed had been planted. Later that afternoon, his assistant walked in with a curious look. "Sir," she said carefully, "the regional director just called. He said some of the staff at that airport only realized after your meeting that you were the passenger from last week." David looked up, slightly amused. "Did they?" "Yes, sir," she said, smiling faintly. "Apparently the gate agent recognized your photo on the company website. She's very nervous now." David chuckled softly. "I'm sure she is. But tell them not to worry. This isn't about embarrassment. It's about learning." That evening, as he left the office, he thought about what might be going through that woman's mind. He imagined her realizing that the passenger she had politely dismissed was the man whose name was on every paycheck. He wondered if she felt regret, shame, or maybe just surprise. But more than that, he hoped she understood the real lesson, that everyone deserves respect, no matter what they look like or where they sit. The next morning, His phone buzzed with a message from the regional director. "The gate agent has requested to speak with you personally, sir. She wants to apologize." David paused for a moment, then typed back, "Tell her she doesn't owe me an apology. She owes the next passenger her understanding." He meant every word. He wasn't interested in public apologies or dramatic moments. He wanted sincerity, quiet growth, the kind that didn't need cameras or headlines. Still, later that week, he agreed to meet the woman. The meeting was arranged at the same airport where everything had happened. When he arrived, she was already waiting near the staff office, her hands clasped nervously. "Good morning," David said gently. "Good morning, sir," she said, her voice low. I didn't realize who you were." "I feel terrible," David smiled softly. "Please don't, you're not in trouble. I just wanted to have a conversation." She nodded, eyes downcast. "I shouldn't have assumed anything that day. I was just following the system, but I could have handled it better. Maybe," David said, his tone calm. "But this isn't just about you. It's about what the system teaches you to prioritize. Sometimes we get so focused on rules that we forget about people." She looked up, surprised by his kindness. "Thank you for saying that, sir. I'll remember this, truly." "I know you will," David said, "and I hope you share it with others. Every person who walks up to that counter has a story. Treat them like they matter even if you think they don't." The woman nodded, her eyes wet. "I will, sir. Thank you for giving me the chance," he smiled. "We all learn. That's what matters." After the meeting, as he walked through the airport, several staff members watched him quietly. Some nodded respectfully, others whispered. He didn't mind. He wasn't there to intimidate anyone. He was there to remind them that leadership wasn't about power, it was about presence. Before heading to his car, he paused at one of the large windows overlooking the runway. A plane with the Horizon Air logo was just taking off, its engines roaring softly as it lifted into the sky. He watched it climb, thinking about how many lives were being carried on that plane, each one with its own story, its own reason for traveling. He thought about how strange it was that the man who owned the airline had once been mistaken for someone who didn't belong in first class. And yet that was the beauty of it. Life had a way of humbling you, reminding you that success didn't make you immune to prejudice, but it gave you the chance to change it for others. As he stood there, a family nearby caught his eye, a mother, father, and two small kids laughing as they watched planes take off. The children pointed excitedly every time a plane lifted into the clouds. The parents smiled patiently, taking photos. David smiled too. He saw in them what he had always believed flying was really about, not seats or status, but connection. The promise that people could go anywhere, see anyone, and start over if they needed to. He turned to leave, his heart lighter. The small act of being denied a seat had led him here, to a moment of deeper understanding, a reminder of why he started this journey in the first place. He walked out of the terminal with quiet confidence. The same people who had once overlooked him now greeted him with warmth. But he didn't carry pride in that. He carried purpose. In the car, as the driver pulled away, David glanced back at the airport building growing smaller behind him. He whispered to himself, "That's how change begins, not in anger, but in awareness." And for the first time in a long while, he felt that the company he built wasn't just growing in size. It was growing in heart. A few weeks passed after the meeting at the airport. The incident had slowly faded from the gossip cycle among employees, but it had left a quiet mark on everyone who heard about it. The story spread across departments not because David wanted it to, but because people were talking about it on their own. They told each other how the CEO had been denied a seat on his own airline, and how calmly he handled it. It became a story about dignity rather than power, about patience rather than pride. David didn't want fame from it. What he wanted was reflection. He knew how people could sometimes forget the purpose of their work when the routine became too familiar. He wanted to remind them that in every small act of service there was meaning. He spent the next few days drafting something personal, his own letter to every Horizon Air employee. He wrote it himself without help from his communications team. The words were plain and simple. He spoke about the experience not as a complaint but as a lesson. He said, "The true first class is not a seat. It's how we treat people no matter where they sit." The letter was sent to every employee, from pilots to janitors, from senior managers to new trainees. It became something people printed and pinned to their walls or lockers. The message felt real, not like a company announcement, but like a conversation from someone who had lived it. Soon after that, David called for a meeting with the company's training department. He wanted to introduce a new program, something deeper than just customer service training. He wanted a program about empathy, respect, and awareness. He wanted it to focus on human connection, not just procedure. At first, some people doubted if it was necessary. "We already have customer care workshops," one manager said during a planning meeting. "Do we really need to change everything?" David listened patiently. Then he said softly, "You can teach someone how to smile, but you can't force them to care. What we need to build is understanding. That takes more than a script. It takes a change of heart." That line stayed in everyone's mind long after the meeting ended. The new program was called Project Horizon Heart. It started small with workshops and open discussions where employees could share experiences, both good and bad. People talked about passengers they remembered, moments when they made someone's day, and times when they might have judged someone unfairly. The first few sessions were quiet. People were hesitant to speak. But slowly, as stories came out, the rooms began to feel lighter. One flight attendant talked about how she once assumed a young man couldn't afford to upgrade, only to find out later he was traveling home from a charity mission. A gate agent shared how an elderly passenger taught her patience when he struggled with online check-in. David attended some of those sessions quietly, sitting in the back of the room without introducing himself. He didn't want attention. He wanted to listen. He wanted to feel what his employees felt when they spoke about their daily struggles and small triumphs. Sometimes he stayed afterward, shaking hands and saying simple words like, "Thank you for sharing that." Those moments meant more to people than long speeches ever could. One afternoon, while leaving one of the training sessions, David saw the same gate agent who had once denied him the first-class seat. She was talking with another staff member, smiling genuinely. When she saw him, she paused for a moment, then walked over. "Sir," she said softly, "I just wanted to thank you again. That day changed how I see my job. I didn't realize how much one small action could mean." David smiled warmly. "I'm glad to hear that," he said. "You don't know how many people will have a better experience because of you." She smiled, nodding. "I'll do my best to keep that promise." As she walked away, David felt something inside him settle, a quiet sense of peace. He knew change was happening, slowly but surely. Months went by and the company began to feel different. Passengers noticed the change too. They began leaving positive feedback, saying how the staff seemed more attentive, more human, more kind. The words respectful, understanding, and warm started showing up more often in customer reviews. It wasn't about perfection. Delays still happened, mistakes still occurred, but the attitude behind how people handled them had transformed. The staff cared. They listened. They treated people as people, not problems to solve. One day, a journalist from a travel magazine reached out to David. She wanted to write a story about the company's cultural shift. She said, "Your airline's reputation has improved dramatically. People say it feels different when they fly with you." "What changed?" David smiled when he heard that. He didn't mention the airport incident directly. Instead, he said, "We stopped focusing only on getting people places. We started focusing on how they feel while getting there." When the article was published, it called Horizon Air the airline with heart. That phrase stuck. Soon, passengers began using it too. Even on social media, people posted about kind encounters with flight attendants or check-in staff using the hashtag #Airline with heart. The company didn't turn the story into a marketing campaign. David didn't want to profit from what had once been a moment of discrimination. Instead, he asked his marketing team to create short videos sharing real employee stories. Moments of kindness, compassion, and connection. They weren't scripted. They were genuine. People loved them. One of the videos showed a flight attendant helping a nervous first-time flyer calm down before takeoff. Another showed a staff member personally walking an elderly man to his gate when he got lost. Each clip ended with the simple message, "Every seat matters." The campaign spread across the internet. It wasn't flashy, but it was real. David watched all this quietly. He never once put his name or face in the center of it. He wanted the story to belong to everyone at Horizon, not just him. Still, one afternoon, while walking through the airport, He overheard two passengers talking. They didn't recognize him, but their conversation made him smile. One of them said, "You know, this airline feels different. People are actually kind here." The other replied, "Yeah, I read somewhere the owner went through something himself. Maybe that's why things changed." David kept walking, his heart full. That evening, as he sat by his office window watching the city lights flicker in the distance, he thought about how strange life could be. Sometimes change came from moments that didn't feel special at all. A small incident, a quiet slight, a random misunderstanding. But those moments could open doors to something bigger if you let them. He realized that the world didn't need louder people. It needed more understanding people. Those who could stay calm when hurt, who could turn an insult into inspiration, and who could teach without shaming. That was how he wanted to lead. A few months later, Horizon Air won an award for Best Customer Care Airline of the Year. When David went on stage to accept it, the hall was filled with applause. But he didn't talk about profits or growth. He simply said, "This award belongs to the people who make others feel welcome, even when no one is watching. That's the real first class." The audience stood up and clapped, not just out of respect for his success, but for his sincerity. After the event, reporters asked him if he would ever share the full story that started it all. He smiled and said, "Maybe one day, but for now, the lesson is enough." That night, as he returned home, he thought about how much had changed. The world was still imperfect. People still judged too quickly sometimes, but at least in his corner of it, something had shifted. He walked into his living room, sat down on the couch, and closed his eyes. For the first time in a long time, he felt truly proud, not of owning an airline, but of what that airline now stood for. Before going to bed, he looked at a framed photo on his desk, an old picture of his first small plane, the one that started his journey years ago. He whispered to himself, "We made it." The next morning, he flew again, this time to visit a new branch of Horizon Air that had just opened in another city. When he checked in at the airport, the agent smiled at him warmly and said, "Welcome back. Mr. Johnson, we're honored to have you." He smiled back and said simply, "I'm honored to be here." As he walked toward the gate, he noticed how different the atmosphere felt now. There was laughter, calmness, kindness in the air. Employees greeted travelers genuinely. The same place that once reminded him of judgment now reflected growth. When he boarded the plane, he sat quietly in his seat, this time in first class, not because he needed to, but because he had earned it through patience and grace. The flight attendant came by and offered him a drink. "Thank you," he said softly. "You're very welcome, sir," she replied with a smile. As the plane began to taxi down the runway, he looked out the window at the city below. The clouds moved gently across the sky. The engines hummed, and he felt a deep calm wash over him. He realized that sometimes life's most painful moments are just the beginning of something good. What had started as a quiet humiliation had turned into hope, kindness, and change for hundreds of people. He smiled to himself, not with pride, but with peace. Because now he knew, no matter who sat in which seat, everyone had a story that deserved respect. And somewhere high above the clouds, he finally felt free.